Today, I want to talk about population ecology. You may remember that last time we had just introduced the niche concept, the concept that every species has to fit into its environment and find a space within the environment where they can thrive and succeed. Well, now what we're going to do is look at how the niche concept affects population size. So let's start by thinking about populations. And one observation we can make in nature is that most populations of most species are fairly stable over time. And even if the population fluctuates up and down a lot, the population still has limits within which the population is maintained. So, what causes these limits? Well, the surprising thing is that the population size of a species is determined by the amount of niche space, or what we might want to call niche opportunity, available in an ecosystem. Now, you may remember the wolf spider we looked at in the video. Suppose that a wolf spider requires grassland and a square meter of space. Then there could be no more wolf spiders than the number of square meters of grassland. That would set the upper limit. And this is a bit of a surprising result, that it is the physical environment as well as the biological environment, in other words, the other species that compete with that species for niche space, as well as the other species that provide niche space. Those are what determine niche opportunity, and therefore those are what determine population size. So if more wolf spiders are born than niche opportunity exists, then we'll have competition for territory, and wolf spiders that don't get territories will emigrate, in other words, leave the area, or suffer higher mortality. So the surprising thing about this is that it is not reproductive strategies that determine population size. Let's look at that. Evolutionarily, we know that each individual is trying to place as many offspring as possible into the next generation. And when we use that language, what we mean is that placing as many offspring in the next generation is what would be selected for. Those individuals that are most successful at placing a lot of offspring or more offspring in the next generation will be selected for. And as a result of this, the number of offspring born to a population often exceeds the environment's capacity to hold them. In other words, there is not enough niche opportunity in each habitat. And this gives rise to intraspecific competition, which is competition between members of the same species for space and for survival. Now, each individual species evolves its own reproductive strategy, which is whether it's better to have more and therefore usually smaller offspring, or fewer and thus larger offspring. And those are determined by the constraints on the organism and the constraints in the environment, and what turns out to have been better in the evolutionary past. The big lesson here is that reproductive strategy does not affect population size. It doesn't matter how many are born or what the death rate is. That population size, at least maximum population size, is determined by the amount of niche opportunity. So even though populations are limited by niche opportunity, we want to know how populations behave, and this is called population biology. In the simplest model, population growth rate can be seen to be the result of two opposing processes, births and deaths, and we talked about this with human population. The population growth rate is given the variable little r, and it can be measured as little r equals b minus d, where b is the birth rate and d is the death rate. And you saw we often measure that as number per thousand. If b minus d is greater than 0, then the population grows. If b equals d, then the population growth is 0. And if b is less than d, population growth is negative. I think that's pretty straightforward to you. The surprising thing sometimes for people is to realize that when B is greater than D, populations grow exponentially. In other words, it looks like this. Suppose a certain bacteria can double its population every 20 minutes. A graph of their population would look like the one you see here for the first 3 hours. And you can see by 180 minutes, or 3 hours, there is a very large growth in the population, and the population has is in the exponential phase of growth. This is called a J curve for obvious reasons. If you extend it out, it looks like a J. in some people's imagination. And the exponential curve results anytime anything grows by a constant percentage per unit time. As long as death rates in this case, in this bacteria, are less than 1 per 20 minutes, these bacteria will show exponential growth rate. It turns out that birth and death rates change with population density, and this has important consequences for population growth. As population density increases, birth rates often start to decrease and death rates often start to increase. So let's think about that for a second. Why would that be? Well, as density increases, competition for resources, let's say food, increases. And as food gets increasingly scarce, some individuals will not have enough food to actually reproduce, or they won't be able to reproduce as many offspring, and so birth rate will fall. Similarly, as there's competition, that may lead to some individuals starving if food is enough. It may lead to individuals having to wander out of habitat into habitats that don't support them very well. And as they wander about, they may be subject to more predation, or they may never find an appropriate niche again if they wander out of their territory. Predation may become more common, which increases death rates, as I already mentioned. And diseases and parasites, these may become more common or spread more quickly through a population at high density, which is an issue that we at the current moment are thinking a lot about as human beings with the spread of COVID-19. So at low population density, there's a lower amount of mortality, which means death. And at high population density, there's a larger amount of mortality. The opposite happens with birth rate in general. So what happens when birth and death rate change? If B decreases or D increases quickly and smoothly in response to changes in population density, then we would expect exponential growth to slowly decrease until the point where B minus D equals 0, and we get to no population increase, and the population curve will level off. And that's what we see here. It's called the logistic growth curve. It's sometimes called an S-curve. And you can see that in this particular example, about midway up the graph at about half density, the population birth rate starts to slow down, or at least the growth rate starts to slow down, and it levels off here. This place where it levels off is called the carrying capacity, and that is often denoted by the symbol K. Now, there are many variations on this theme in nature, especially when there is a lag between population density and birth and death. If B and D don't change immediately in response to a change in density, then the population may overshoot its carrying capacity, causing huge increases in mortality later on, or a huge decrease in natality, which, can you guess what that means, right? The birth rate. Good, you got it. So why would B and D have a time lag behind current density? Well, you could take a guess on that. If you said it's because often individuals' reproductive output right now depends on what happened to them in the past, give yourself a pat on the back, because that's what it is. What if this year's birth rate is in response to last year's density? Think of an animal that overwinters as an adult and then lays eggs in the early spring, or a mammal that gets pregnant in the fall and then has babies in the early spring. That's one of the ways that could happen. When death rate is due to disease, that's another way, because disease often takes a while to get going. Same is true with predators. So these lagging responses of B and D in response to density cause a great variety of population curves, as we will see in the next slide. Here's a paramecium, and if we put a paramecium in a simple tank and give it the same amount of food each day, it grows beautifully in an S-curve. It grows in this beautiful logistic curve. But here's Daphnia in a simple tank, and they don't do so well. They have a lag in which they don't reproduce at first, and then all of a sudden they take off, and they overshoot their carrying capacity, then crash down under it, and then eventually they have what's called a damped oscillation around it. Here's a song sparrow, and you can see it never really gets above this, but there's a lot of mortality that sends their population all over the place. And this is probably not controlled by density-dependent factors, but by density-independent factors that kill the song sparrow, such as severe winter storms or lack of food or something like that. And other patterns that we can see in time are this stable oscillation around the carrying capacity. So A is what we call logistic growth, B is what we call damped oscillations, and C and D are what are called stable oscillations. We also see these kinds of cyclic curves when we have predator and prey. And here's an example of a fox and a hare. And the rabbit population grows exponentially, providing a food supply for the foxes. And the most likely stimulus for the rabbit population is an abundance of food. So the rabbits take off because of abundance of food, and then with a time lag, the foxes respond. You should note on this graph that the y-axes are often different. One side will show the prey population, one side will show the predator population, because the predator often has a much smaller population for reasons we discussed earlier. Now, the fox population, or any predator that cycles with its prey like this, is usually dependent on the abundance of the prey. In contrast, the rabbit population may crash for any one of three reasons. And see if you can think of what they are. You can stop the video for a second. Well, here they are. One is more predation by the foxes, although that seems to be often not the major factor for many of these predator-prey cycles. In many cases, they exceed the rate at which food can be produced, and therefore they actually eat themselves to death. The Malthusian starvation actually happens to rabbits, even if it hasn't happened to humans yet. And third thing that often really is important is disease may spread through the population at very high density and cause it to crash quickly. Well, which of these is the most important can only be resolved by studying each system. There is no generally true rule. Once the rabbit crashes, however, the fox is going to crash in response. And then the rabbit crashes, the food plants come back, the rabbit increases again, and then with the time lag, the fox responds, etc., etc. You can see in these systems, it's very hard to determine a carrying capacity for each species. You might draw a line through the middle and think that that's a theoretical level, but it's a really tough question. Some mortality factors that we encounter in populations are not due to densities. The factors we've talked about up to now tend to be density dependent. Competition, predation, and parasitism are all density dependent because they are more likely to increase at high density and be a bigger factor at high density than they are at low density. In contrast, we have a bunch of density independent mortality factors. These don't change in response to density, but instead cull a certain percentage no matter what the population size, or in some years they take more because there's more severe weather, let's say, or a natural disaster occurs. And in other years there's less severe weather and fewer natural disasters, and therefore the populations fluctuate in a non-predictable manner up and down. So, some populations are limited by these density-independent factors, and that's what's shown here in this graph. We see here an exponential curve, here a density-dependent curve, and here density-independent limits, which looks like that song sparrow curve we saw earlier. And this is very common in insects, which suffer a large degree of mortality due to weather. And that's probably true for song sparrows too, because the strategy in song sparrows may often be to winter near their nesting grounds so they can be on their territory and hold on to it first before others get back. And if a severe winter weather event happens, a lot of those song sparrows are going to die. In these populations, birth rates are always high because food is rarely scarce, and death rates are unaffected by density in general. So population density shows no typical patterns over time, but instead these jagged curves as we've seen here. Here's another example of a moth showing this. What's been done here is the mortality factors have been listed, and you can see that the density-dependent factors, the bottom five, are relatively constant, and the density-independent mortality factors, the ones on top, vary all over the place and therefore cause the population to vary over time. So that's it for today. I'm hoping that you now have an understanding that populations and population size are limited by the amount of niche opportunity for most animals, although we saw in humans that this hasn't been the case yet. And that populations are affected by their predators, their diseases, their parasites, and that when population density gets high, those kinds of factors are more important. They're so-called density-dependent factors. But in some other organisms, it's density-independent factors that affect them. But underlying this all is the fact that all populations have the potential to grow exponentially. So that's it for today. Until next time, study hard.